Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett. I call this one Elf or Alien. People of course have been seeing humanoids of all kinds for a very long time. And we're talking very tall humanoids, short humanoids, really every shape, size, and color you can imagine. And I think the most popular explanation for these humanoids is extraterrestrials. But that might not be true in every case. In fact, in these cases, I think there might very well be another explanation. These are cases involving what appear to be little people who are native to our planet. And if you examine the cultures across the world, pretty much all of them have a long history of strange supernatural creatures. Call them what you will, elves, dwarves, leprechauns, kobolds, fairies. Pretty much every location on this planet has reports of these little people. This is often thought to be mythological, but if you look into the actual reports, they're really quite compelling, and they haven't gone away. There are in fact many modern cases, and that's what I'd really like to talk about today. I investigated with my own cases. That's what inspired me to take a little bit of a deeper look into this. And I was really quite surprised to find so many cases of these elves. Or perhaps ETs? I don't know. There's a little bit of bleed through in some of these cases. You can make up your own mind about them, but I can tell you, again, they do come from all over the world. Many of them are involving multiple witnesses. Some do have physical evidence. There does seem to be a direct UFO association in some of them. Certainly not all of them. But I've got 10 cases that I found particularly compelling, including one I investigated personally. And that is what I would like to cover today. So, there's quite a bit of cases. Let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to present, I call An Elf in Bronte, Finland. This is a very early case, way back in 1885, which, as it turns out, does seem to involve a landed UFO. This case actually comes from Albert Rosales and his amazing multi-volume books, Humanoids Among Us. It's a pretty interesting account. Again, this occurred in 1885 in Bronte, Finland. This is near the city of Kiilstofte. And it involves a young woman, a mother of 3 children, who was picking berries in the forest when she came upon something that shouldn't be there. She said it resembled a kettle lock, as you can see pictured here, and it was sort of parked there on a small hill. But besides this large object stood an elf-like creature that she said was carrying something that resembled an axe on his shoulder. Now this quite frightened her, and she returned to her village, and after a couple of hours she went back to the location, this time with other villagers, but the object and the elf were gone. So she told this to her grandmother, who is 71 years old, and related this story, which originally comes from researcher Mervi Virtanen of Finland. It's an amazing case. So yeah, I mean, that sounds like a classic little elf. However, given that there was apparently a landed UFO of some size, I don't know. I honestly don't know. And there's so many cases that sort of raise these very serious questions about who and what these beings are. And here's another one, which I call The Little Man of Mongaup, New York. This is another really interesting case which took place way back in 1947. It involves a gentleman by the name of Ron Quinn, who published his account in Fate magazine. And it's quite a detailed story, and I don't know, sounds like an elf to me. I love this case. August 1947 was really about, 1 month after the Roswell UFO crash. Probably just a coincidence, but at any rate, the main witness is Ron Quinn, and this took place again in Mongaup Valley in New York. This is east of Monticello, and it was August of 1942 when Ron Quinn, who was 10 years old, was with his family on vacation in the country. They had spent most of the day outside, but Ron got in trouble and was told to spend an hour inside the cottage while the others remained outside to play. So he was inside when he heard a soft tapping noise on the window. And I'll just let Ron say what happened in his own words, because he describes it very well. As Ron says, "I looked in the direction of the sound and froze in fear. Standing on the outside of the window ledge was a small, oddly dressed man about 12 inches high. The little fellow did not entirely resemble the traditional elf, gnome, or leprechaun we have all seen depicted in various books and movies. After all these years, I can still describe that little man, down to the last detail, as his image is branded deep in my memory. He had an odd-looking hat, dark green in color. A short, dark gray beard covered his lower face. From beneath his hat, silky, curly hair cascaded down and covered his ears, which I never saw. His light gray shirt fit somewhat tightly around his upper body, but the sleeves were quite baggy. The little guy's trousers were the same color and ended below the knee. Something resembling a black belt encircled his wide waist, but it had no buckle. He wore dark brown, soft-looking boots that ended just below the trousers. His extremely large eyes were his most striking feature, and the expression on his little face was that of pure friendship and love." So this is quite a striking thing for Ron to see, and despite this tiny man's friendly appearance, he became terrified, because even at age 10, he knew that such things were not supposed to exist. So he looked away, hoping that this was an illusion that would disappear. But of course the knocking sound came again. Ron looked back, and the man smiled and waved his hand at him. And at this point he noticed that this little man held a small walking stick, and he was using this little stick to tap the window. So Ron could hardly believe his eyes, but it was clear that this figure was no illusion, and as he says, "What I was looking upon was real in every sense of the word, including the movement of his body and the shadow he cast on the ledge below. Everything was there." So at this point, this little figure motioned for Ron to come closer, and after a moment, Ron gathered his courage, he knelt forward and slowly opened the window. And this little man eyed him closely, and as Ron says, he kept smiling and looking me over as if he had never been this close to a human before. As I reached out to touch this strange individual that had invaded my life, he stepped back, and his head tilted from left to right as he inspected me from every angle. After smiling once more, the little guy leaped from the ledge, landing gracefully on the grass below. He ran with long leaps across the lawn, stopping momentarily to look back, then disappeared among the shadows of the trees. So Ron was amazed, and he jumped up and told his family, but to his disappointment nobody believed him, even after he showed them a clear footprint on the grass made by this little man. He told his friends, and they teased him mercilessly. However, even today, Ron is still sticking to his story. As he says, "In all this time, that one experience remains high on my list of pleasant memories. I've told this story numerous times at parties and so on, and have received various explanations. To this day, I am certain that the little character was real and not something conceived in the mind of a young man with a, quote, very active imagination, as Mom had put it." Now, one perhaps really telling detail was mentioned by Ron, who said, quote, "The most striking feature was his extremely large eyes." This is a comment often made by people who encountered ETs, but otherwise, this does not sound like an ET. So that's the little man of Mongaup, New York, and as you can see, it inspired Ron Quinn to actually write an entire book about little people. This is far more common, I think, than most people realize. It just doesn't get a whole lot of attention. But these are definitely still going on. As we see, we're going sort of chronologically through these stories. There are some very much current stories. But here's another one which I personally investigated. I call this one My Mysterious Friend. This is actually the title that the witness gave himself to his account. And wow, what an interesting story, because he not only saw this little elf-like creature once or twice, but multiple times. This one occurred in Lakewood, Colorado in 1945, when the main witness was just a tiny little boy himself. But again, as we shall see, it affected him for the rest of his life. So it was 1945, and Galen Sharp was in his home in Lakewood, Colorado. He was only 4 years old when he first met his little elf. At least that's what he thought it was. As Galen says, he just stepped out of the bookcase that stood against the wall. He was just as tall as I, if not a little taller. His head and eyes were large, but normal-looking. In my memory, he looked like I would have called an elf, had I known what an elf was then. He was not at all scary or threatening. Though he was small, he didn't look like a child, and was as solid and real as anyone. He was wearing a little short jacket and dark square-cut pants with worn leather shoes. His nose was round. He wore no cap or hat and was bald. His movements were quick and deliberate. So Galen did have siblings. He had many friends. He had great parents who were very loving and nurturing. He was a very happy child. And now, seeing this elf-like being, he was even more delighted, especially when this elf began to speak to him and share special stories with him. And in fact, as Galen says, he told me about many wondrous things. But being only 4, I couldn't understand most of the things he told me. However, he was friendly and helpful, and could really make me laugh. Now the elf did share his name with Galen. This is a name which Galen has chosen to keep private, but the elf did call Galen by his own nickname, Topper, which Galen had earned due to his very fine blonde hair, which had a tendency to kind of float around his head. So after a short little introduction, this little man just disappeared. Galen, of course, quickly ran to his mother and excitedly told her about his new friend. And after listening to what he had to say, Galen's mother just kind of smiled and said that he had, quote, an imaginary friend. So this really puzzled Galen. As he says, I didn't know what the word imaginary meant at that time, so I still considered him very real. So time moved on, and Galen wasn't really expecting another visit, but he got one. It was just a short time later when his elf friend appeared again. As before, the visit was very short. The elf appeared, kind of joked and played around with Galen for a few minutes, and then disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived. Once again, he tried to tell his parents, but he was unable to convince them that his elf friend was real. As Galen says, my parents were not concerned, and didn't seem interested in my friend. I guess the word imaginary took all the reality out of it for them. They seemed amused, but not curious at all, and never asked about it. So this was having a huge effect on Galen, and over the next year, this elf appeared at least 3 more times. The visits were few and somewhat far between. They occurred without any warning, but it was always the same sort of thing. This little elf-like creature looked very solid and real, always wore the same strange outfit, and was always very happy and jolly. As Galen says, I really didn't see him very often, maybe only 5 times, possibly more, but certainly not every day. He was not a constant companion, and he would always show up unexpectedly, although only when I was alone and never at night. But I was always glad to see him. We would play together and talk about interesting things, joke and laugh. Once in the yard, he put a bushel basket on his head and clowned around while I laughed myself silly. So there was one curious feature that Galen did notice, was that this elf, although clearly solid, as he would often grab objects and move them around, he never actually touched Galen himself. As Galen says, he did touch and handle things, yet I can't recall him ever touching me. We mostly talked about things. I knew so little about the world that I didn't question his sudden appearances in my home. He seemed to know all about me and everything else. There was one very special visitation in which Galen's little elf friend actually brought along another elf. As Galen says, one of the most remarkable memories with him was meeting another elf like him just outside the back door of our garage. The new elf was possibly taller, a little older, and dressed much like my friend. They told me about exciting things to come. I was amazed and astounded with all they told me. I remember the time vividly, even how and where we were standing. And then came bad news. Galen's family had decided to move. Galen was not happy about it because he was afraid his elf friend wouldn't be able to follow him. So next time the elf appeared, Galen vowed to ask if the elf would follow. And sure enough, a short time later, this elf did show up again unannounced. By this time, Galen was 5 years old, and after some joking around, Galen shared the sad news. As Galen says, in his own words, I told him we were going to move to another house far away and asked him to come with us. He explained that he had to stay there and couldn't move away. I was heartbroken. I cried and I pleaded with him to come, but he was adamant. He couldn't leave that area. So Galen was devastated, and they moved to another area, and of course, that was the last of it. Galen never saw this elf again, but did have a profound effect on his life, and he is certain that this elf was not an imaginary friend and was absolutely real. As he says, I had no good reason for an imaginary friend. If he actually was imaginary, then I may be the only child who ever got dumped by his imaginary friend. I know it wasn't pretending or fantasizing because looking back, I had no control over it. Take for instance his refusal to come with me. I don't think we even said goodbye. My own assessment of this experience is that it really happened. However, I believe that it had a positive, healthy effect on my life. Unfortunately, I don't remember any of the stories they told me, yet since that experience, I have been a lifelong seeker of spiritual truth, and in 2012 I wrote a book that was the culmination of what I called my, quote, intuitive research. So the title of that book is What Am I? A Study of Non-Volitional Living. It was very well received and followed up with a number of other books all about spirituality and enlightenment. So Galen's early childhood visitations really had a long effect on his life, and growing up, he heard about greys and ET abductions and wondered briefly if it could have been something like that, but he immediately dismissed that because, as he says, this elf was, quote, not like the greys we know of from abduction stories. I have no memory of anything like an abduction or examination and don't think those happened. I think back on the experience as a learning time and was always happy to see him and listen to him. So Galen doesn't know what to make of this. Was this an elf, a leprechaun, a gnome? He can only say what happened to him. As he says, this little person could be from another dimension or interdimensional, since it didn't fit the ET profile. I have always followed my sense of wonder, and all of my books are spiritual. My friend told me wonderful and amazing things, but I don't remember them. Maybe they were spiritual things, and it has been coming out in my books. Maybe someday I will learn about the reality of my old friend, whether elf or angel, or just who and what he was or is. I have never heard of this happening to anyone else quite this way, and I wonder if anyone hearing this might have had a similar experience and can shed some light on who or what was this wonderful, mysterious visitor of my childhood. So Galen did have a number of really spiritual and paranormal experiences, and at least 4 UFO sightings, which you can read about in my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness. I have to leave a little bit of a teaser for you guys, but yeah, what an amazing account that is. So yeah, that case I did publish in my latest book, Humanoids in High Strangeness, and it is definitely high strangeness. In fact, that's why Galen contacted me. He wanted to know if I had ever heard of or received a report like his. And again, that's what prompted me to sort of take a deeper look into cases like these. And I was surprised to find quite a few. So this, really makes me wonder about some of these reports of elves and fairies and gnomes. And here's another one that I found in Whitley Strieber's book, The Communion Letters, which seems to involve probably an alien. I don't know. I call this one The Alien Elf of San Gabriel, California. And again, the witness in this case was a little boy from San Gabriel, California, who had a very unusual encounter with a little person. It was Christmas morning of 1957 when a 7-year-old child from San Gabriel, California had an experience what he thought first was an elf. As he wrote in a letter to Whitley Strieber, quote, "It must have been between 2 or 3 a.m. and I was lying in bed in my bedroom. I remember I awakened rather suddenly and was quite unable to move, seemingly frozen in bed." The witness, who is anonymous, although he was unable to move, could see out the bedroom, across the living room, and onto the front porch, and that's when things became strange, because as he says, on the porch, seemingly peering into the living room, was a smallish creature I remember thinking to be one of Santa's elves. I was naturally excited and wanted to get up to meet or see this elf much closer. I remember being wide awake and desperately wanting to get up, but patently unable to accomplish this seemingly simple task. He seemed to be about 3 or 4 feet tall and was cream in color. I saw more of a 3/4 profile and could not make much of any other distinguishing features. I was not that fearful, just excited and burning with curiosity. My frustration was building with my seeming inability to rise from bed. I then had a firm sense of, it's okay now, just go back to sleep. It had a parental tone to it, loving yet directive. However, not either of my parents' voices. So the witness fell back asleep. However, this experience was not forgotten because, as he says, on Christmas morning, as my sister was going nuts, I was relatively disinterested in all the stuff around the tree. Instead, I was determined to go out onto the front porch and check for evidence of what I knew was there. Unfortunately, there was no evidence. Nevertheless, the witness still remembers that, quote, "My parents were rather dumbfounded at my spurning Christmas presents in favor of running outside." Now later, this witness would have further UFO experiences, which seems to confirm the validity of this Christmas Day visitation and really point to the ET interpretation. I wish I had more information on this case, because I suspect he probably did have later encounters with ETs, which would point to this being a fairly standard extraterrestrial encounter. Hard to say without more information, but it definitely fits in with this compilation of strange little people. And here's another one which is exceedingly strange. I call this one the Fairy Elf of Appleby, Texas. And this involves what looks like a fairy or an elf, in that it is wearing the kind of clothes we see reported in these cases, but has wings. So, I mean, make of it what you will. It appears to be an absolutely serious report. This is not so much a little person as it is described being quite tall, but it's also fairly recent. We're talking 1976. Another indication that this is still going on all over the world. It was a cold winter morning around 6 a.m. in October of 1976. And the witness lived on 30 acres of forest and hills alone in Appleby, Texas. And she had stepped outside to burn some trash and was surprised at what she saw. A strange being with wings was sitting on a bench in her flower garden watching her with interest. And she said that this figure was actually pretty tall and really strongly built. It was all gray in color, wings, skin, all of it, though it did have solid black eyes to the point where she couldn't see any actual pupil, just pure black eyes. It didn't appear to be a man or woman, kind of genderless, and wasn't wearing any clothes as far as she could tell. But it had this weird way of moving around that reminded her more of an animal than a human. She described this as being very much like a bird, jerks its head around in quick movements. But she says it did have long, white, straight hair, which actually reached down to the middle of its back. It did have pointed ears, pointed backwards like an elf. And it was letting out a series of strange hums when it opened its mouth. She said it almost sounded like it was singing to her or making some kind of a call. And it apparently saw her because she said it seemed to smile at her, at which point everything got blindingly bright, so bright that the witness had to cover her eyes and face, and she could actually feel heat coming from this light. And when the light and the heat died out, she looked where this fairy or elf or this creature had been, but all she saw was this sort of burned spot on the bench. And a closer inspection of this bench revealed that it had to have been heated up at a very high temperature, because it was burned and crumbling at the spot where she had seen this strange being. I think you'll agree that's an absolutely fascinating case, which was posted on a paranormal forum on the internet, and really just bizarre. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. And if it were just a one-off, I'd be more inclined to dismiss it. But as we've seen, it's not. A lot of people are reporting these supernatural creatures, or natural. I'm beginning to wonder if these are just sort of interdimensional beings, because they sort of appear and disappear, but they are all over the world, and there's many recent cases. And here's another one from 1986, and I call this one the Gnome of Santa Clara County, Colorado. This is a really unusual case. It's quite brief, but I think definitely worth mentioning, because again it fits right in with these kinds of stories of little people. This case is quite brief, but really interesting, and again, pretty recent, 1986. This occurred in Santa Clara County, but more specifically in the city of Walsenburg. And it was around 4 p.m. one afternoon in 1986, and the main witness, who is anonymous, was digging out a tree just a few miles west of town and reported seeing this little figure, a man, about 9 inches tall. And he watched it for several minutes from a pretty close vantage point. He estimates that he was about 20 feet away. And looking at this little man, he could see that it was dressed in a one-piece brown garment that looked to him like it was made out of leather. And he said this little being was wearing loose, ankle-length footgear and what he could only call a, quote, Robin Hood sort of cone-shaped hat. And this little man was standing directly beneath a pinyon tree, and he watched this little guy for about 10 minutes until suddenly, without warning, ran off through the brush. He said, as quick as a rabbit. This happened when a co-worker called out to the witness. So yeah, a pretty close-up encounter with one of these little people. There you go, another little dwarf or elf, or call it what you will, but it's wearing what looked like kind of normal clothes with the little Robin Hood hat and the whole deal. This was posted on a Bigfoot forum, actually. You'll find these reports all over the place. People aren't quite sure where to report them. So if you dig deep, you'll find that there's quite a lot of them. And it really surprises me how current some of these cases are. Because here's another one from 1989. and I call this one a tiny dwarf in Rock Creek County, Colorado. This is another Colorado case, so that's kind of interesting. Colorado does have lots of water and rivers and mountains. It's a beautiful state, and apparently there are tiny little creatures roaming throughout the wilderness. This would be something to see, and yeah, this is an unusual case for sure. It's amazing to me how recent these cases are, because yeah, this one occurred at 10 a.m. September 6th, 1989, again in Rock Creek Canyon in Colorado. And again, this comes from Christopher O'Brien, who wrote about it in his book, Enter the Valley. The main witness is Juan Maestas. He's a bow hunter, and he was actually out hunting, quietly stalking a herd of young elk uphill in a wooded area when he heard this twig kind of snapping to his left side. So he froze in his tracks, expecting to see some sort of creature, and he did. He turned to look at the source of the noise and was amazed to see, quote, a fat, ugly little guy about 3 feet tall. And by coincidence, I guess, this fat little ugly guy turned and at the same instant and stared right back at Juan. So he was pretty close, about 50 feet away, and was standing next to a tall pine tree. And as Juan and this little man locked eyes, Juan could see that this little man had a wrinkled forehead, a clean-shaven face, and pinkish skin. He was wearing what appeared to be green overalls with suspenders and a sort of floppy hat, flat on top. This little figure had reddish hair, and it was sticking out from underneath his cap. He had little eyes that almost looked reddish and bloodshot. And this little man gave Juan a sort of smile and then suddenly darted behind the tree. So Juan, being amazed, quickly ran to the spot, but the little man had completely disappeared. However, Christopher O'Brien found out something very interesting. He got confirmation because 2 weeks earlier, in fact very close to this same location, a family of 5 on a picnic had witnessed what appears to be the same or similar entity, as it was also dressed in green overalls and a hat. So, yeah, very strange. So here we go, another little being dressed in green overalls, wearing a little hat. This just does not sound like an ET to me. This does, again, come from Christopher O'Brien. And in his book, The Mysterious Valley, he covers all kinds of weird reports in this one area. There's a huge number of UFO reports here, but other weird stuff as well. So perhaps this is all part of the same phenomena in some way. I don't know. I tend to think that these are actual separate phenomena, and that we do have these little critters running around who are native to our planet and have always been there. They just haven't really reached the mainstream scientific community in terms of being accepted. But so many reports that it's clear to me they're absolutely real. And I honestly don't think they're extraterrestrials. Me personally, I think most of these are just little people that we have living on our planet, that we're sharing this planet with them. And here's another one, which is coincidentally in a very famous UFO location. I call this one the Little Man of Roswell, New Mexico. And this occurred as recently as summer of 1997, and yes, in Roswell, or outside of the town. But definitely, this is not your standard gray ET. This next case is also quite brief. It occurred very early in the morning, about 5:30 a.m. on a summer morning in 1997, again outside of Roswell, New Mexico. And it comes from investigator Robert Gorman. The witness, who is anonymous, had decided to go outside with a cup of coffee to a picnic table in her backyard, and her little chihuahua, Bella, followed her. So she first thought that her neighbor had bought a dog, a little schnauzer, and taking a better look, she noticed it was not a dog at all, but a little man. So she and her dog both ran to the fence to get a better look, and they saw that it was a little man, about 12 inches tall, kind of stocky build, had bushy gray eyebrows and a beard. So your typical kind of little elf or dwarf, I don't know. But he was wearing a gray woolen shirt, no buttons, gray pants, and for a belt he had a sort of a rope tied around his waist. He had soft brown boots that reminded the witness more of socks than anything else. So this actually frightened the little Chihuahua Bella, who ran back into the house and under the bed and actually remained there for most of the day. And according to this witness, the little man kind of had a funny walk in which he would sort of wobble from side to side and quickly ran into a nearby chinaberry tree and disappeared. Now she couldn't see a door or any entrance, but she had the impression that this little man disappeared into the tree itself. That is a detail that keeps coming up in some of these little elf cases. What I found interesting about this particular report was the elf ran to a tree and disappeared apparently inside of it. That does turn up in a number of these cases where the beings are somehow associated with forests or trees. So these are like the elves. They live in the forest. I don't know. Really quite surprising how many reports there are of these. And here's one which comes from actually the Black Forest of Germany. And I call this one, appropriately, an elf in the Black Forest. This occurred quite recently, summer of 2002. This was near Mitteldal. This is right in the Black Forest of Germany, and appears to be your typical elf. As we'll see, it's definitely not your standard ET. I love this case. It's just different, and it's quite recent. Summer of 2002, 5 p.m. This was investigated by Magnus Skarfhedensson and occurred in the town of Mitteltal. This is in the Black Forest in Germany. And the main witness is a 34-year-old German citizen by the name of Hartmut Schultz. And he had this experience while taking a Sunday drive with his girlfriend and an acquaintance. So it was about 5 o'clock and they were on their way home to Mitteltal, and this was just east of this tiny little village, which is where there's a lot of lumber processing, which might be significant because looking out the window, Harmut clearly saw what he believes to be an elf sitting on a pile of newly sawed wood just alongside the road. Now this was a big wood pile, about 5 feet high, and this elf was just sort of resting on top of it like he was enjoying a sunbath, and get this, was leisurely smoking a pipe. So Mr. Schultz, was in the car and was moving pretty slowly, so he was able to study this elf figure clearly for a good time. And he could see that it was wearing brown clothes and had a hat on its head, like they often seem to do. But while his car was actually passing right by this elf seemed to notice that he was being watched and seemed to be surprised. And it also seemed to make him happy because this elf sprang to his feet and seemed to jump for joy when he apparently realized that he was being seen by another human being. And he actually not only jumped up, but started to run alongside the car, which was, still moving quite slow. So this little elf actually faced Hartmut, and who was still looking at him. But this elf couldn't quite keep up with the car itself. But the witness did get the impression that the elf wanted to know more about him, or possibly even attempted to communicate with him. However, he was driving and left this elf standing on the side of the road, kind of staring back at him. And what's really interesting is he was not the only one who saw it. Hartmut's girlfriend also saw this elf-like creature. And according to them, it seemed to them that this elf was just kind of watching the traffic, knowing that most humans were not likely able to see him. But apparently, something about Hartmut gave him the ability to see him. Perhaps he had psychic abilities. This is what the researcher Magnus speculated. Anyway, it's a really unusual recent case of one of these weird elf-like creatures. So the researcher in this case, actually does work at an elf museum. Who knew that there was such a thing? But they've been collecting hundreds upon hundreds of these reports. So clearly it's a lot more common than people realize, which I think kind of makes sense, because if you saw something like this, who would you tell? I mean, even UFO researchers, I think, would be hard-pressed to accept some of these stories. And I think the best evidence for their veracity is honestly the huge number of these cases and how consistent they are in the description of these beings wearing these little leather suits, coveralls, overalls, little leather boots, a belt like a rope, and a little furry hat. I mean, this is just incredibly consistent. And I just can't emphasize it enough. There's so many of these cases. And here's another one, very recent, 2003. This comes from the Rough River State Park in Kentucky. And that's what I call it, the Little Man of Rough River State Park. This is a really interesting account of one of these elves. And now I just want to present one more case, the most recent one. And this, occurred on June 24, 2003, during the afternoon. And as I said, in the Rough River State Park in Kentucky. The main witness is anonymous. He had gone canoeing and was just kind of having a week of resting and relaxing in an isolated natural area. But for some reason, the sense of nervousness and queasiness came over him. He was inexplicably anxious, he said, and he couldn't quite figure out why. But he felt like something bad was going to happen. And taking these sensations very seriously, he became extremely cautious while canoeing on this river. And after several miles, he paddled the canoe to the riverbank, tied it to a tree, and went out to explore the area. And looking down about 8 or 10 feet into the creek, he saw what looked like a clay jar. And he thought, maybe this is some old archaeological artifact. So he started to walk towards this object down the creek, but it was extremely slippery with mud, and he stopped just short of the water and very close to this artifact, which looked like an old earthenware pot, sort of like a clay crock pot. But looking at it, he could see it didn't look that old. And so he actually walked up to it, poked at it, and this is when he saw tiny little handprints on it. And he first thought, are those raccoon prints? But they didn't look like it. He said they looked like human handprints, but they were only about an inch wide. So he grabbed a stick and tried to pry this thing loose. But this is when he heard a noise, and then he heard what sounded like little kids laughing coming from down the creek, just a short way down. And he pulled this crock jar out of the mud, and he heard somebody screaming. He said it sounded like a little girl, very high-pitched, quite loud. Not knowing what to do, he grabs this jar and starts to scramble up the muddy bank of the creek. And looking back, he saw something moving down towards the creek. So he sat down and looked at the jar, trying to reason the handprints, walked back along the creek, and stopping and looking, peeking through the bushes to see if he could see who was out there. Then, when he looked over the bank, he saw them. 2 little people standing, he says, under a foot, about 10 inches tall. He said they had very pale skin, little brown leather pants held up by suspenders. They were shirtless, bare-chested, had little pointy hats made of what he believed to be leather, as well as little leather shoes that went up past the ankle. He said they had red hair and blue eyes, but yeah, tiny little hands, only an inch wide. So he's pretty sure that they were the ones who were touching this clay pot. So they could see him and saw him watching him, but they didn't really seem to mind and continued their task. They were like pulling this stump down the muddy creek with what he believed to be long leather ropes, or almost strings they looked like to him. He says they were actually really clean considering they were working in the mud. So he's watching this and then heard this thumping back where he had first gone in the creek. And looking back, he saw 3 more of these little guys who were identical in appearance to the first 2. And they had pushed that clay pot, that crock jar, back down onto the creek. And they were all laughing in this really high-pitched laughter, again reminding him of a bunch of kids. At that point, there was a loud snapping noise, and they were all gone. However, he says their footprints were plainly visible in the mud. But they were gone, and so was the crock jar and the wooden stump. They had all vanished in literally a split second. So there you go. It leaves physical evidence, footprints and everything. So this is not somebody imagining these things, though these could very well be interdimensional creatures. People have talked about how ETs might be interdimensional. Well, I think that's kind of a cop-out, honestly, because every entity on this planet, and other planets for that matter, has interdimensional aspects. I mean, we have a soul, we go to the other side. Every entity is interdimensional. I just think that perhaps some of these have mastered the ability to move into the 4th or 5th dimensions or what have you, like we do see with accounts of Bigfoot disappearing in a flash, or just not being seen and then not being seen. So these are just 10 cases. Again, I did cover one of these, the account My Mysterious Friend by Galen Sharp, in my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness, because I want people to be aware that there is a lot of stuff going on that we still don't fully understand, and that not all accounts of humanoids might necessarily be extraterrestrials in the classic sense. And some of these that we think are elves might in fact be extraterrestrials. I think it's a two-way street. But either way, these cases are clearly real. There's so many of them. That alone, I think, makes it important that we are aware of them. And boy, it certainly is interesting. I don't know how I would react if I saw one of these little guys, but I think it sure would be something to see. Well, that's it for today. I really want to thank you for watching. I hope you found it interesting and maybe even learned a little bit. I just want to say, keep asking questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important, just like these little people are, keep having fun. Bye now.